I guess growing up being Japanese American, when you're younger, you kind of don't realize that means anything. You just realize once in a while things will happen that make you feel different, right? People make fun of how you look. They assume maybe you have an accent, the squinty eye thing. And with the last name Honda, you get teased a little bit about your name in general. But I think for the most part, you seem like you're a normal person until something happened.
I played a lot of sports growing up, and I remember when I was young, I had a friend, and he asked me, what, ethnicity I was. I said Japanese, and then he said, "Oh, well, your grandpa killed my grandpa at Pearl Harbor."
I think starting from elementary school, I knew that I was different from other people, just in like how I looked, and I don't think it was like in a nice way, if that makes sense.
That was kind of the first I recall being younger, hearing about that and things like that. So I did ask my parents about Pearl Harbor, got the history of it. Little did he know that my grandpa fought for the U.S. in that war in the 442, and they had, the highest casualties, most commendations and medals in that division. But that was my first kind of like wow moment about my identity, that I was different.
And so I think because that happened at such a young age, I was like not as proud to be Japanese American.
When I was younger, I didn't realize it was being othered. And still, like umpteen years later, I'm still othered. And I didn't really feel like I had a place. I just felt like I had one foot in each camp.
When I was a child and showing up to the park, showing up to baseball tryout, show up to basketball tryout, I had to earn my respect. They just saw a little Asian kid walking on the court or walking on the field. They didn't know what I could do. So there's automatically, it felt like a stereotype or a stigma against me. So it's pretty much, I look Japanese. There's some things about me that are Japanese, but because we're fourth generation, we've been disconnected from our roots. My grandparents passed away when I was pretty young, so I didn't get really the connection from them. So really all I knew was white rice for dinner every single day, bowls of ramen, bowls of udon, and that was about it.
From a cultural perspective, looking back as a child, there was a lot, it's just we didn't know. For a lot of, I think, Sansei generation like myself, we didn't do a good job of talking to our parents about what happened to them and the experiences they went through growing up. They never talked about it. We didn't really know we were different, right, until, like I said, things would happen, and then you start questioning the things that they went through. I didn't learn a lot until my parents got much older and sicker, unfortunately. So as they were in the last years of their life, I started to actually have real conversations with them. And again, you realize how much pain and suffering they really went through to be where they're at today.
I feel like as generations go, Japanese American history is just getting so watered down. And I grew up with my grandparents, hearing stories from them about the camps. There was a musical that George Takei did that said everything that the Japanese got when they left the camps was like $20 in a bus ticket to start their lives over. And so I think about what I have today is based off of what my grandparents did with $20 in a bus ticket.
As each generation goes along, you see a little bit more of that connection, I think, is starting to get lost. As I got even older, and again, you wanted to learn about what did our Issei and Nisei go through for us to actually still be here and to be thriving the way we are, is to try to connect with that family and find out what they went through and learn through research what they went through, so that we could better understand and appreciate all the sacrifices they went through for us to be where we're at. But also to explain to my kid why it's important to not forget where you came from.
Japan underwent significant transformation during the Meiji period, 1868 to 1912, marked by rapid industrialization and modernization. While Japan was transforming after opening the door to another world, it also saw waves of immigration.
そのタロクさんがアメリカに行ったんだけども、そのタロクさんのことは私が子供の頃から時々両親に聞いていました。その時よりもより良い生活を求めて、またこう夢を持って夢を叶えたいという気持ちで新天地を目指されたというふうに思います。
So the Japanese folks that came to the US were mostly in agriculture and farmers. And so especially in California, they were really successful as farmers. Because of that, there was a lot of resistance against them that was manifested in legislation. So for example, there were these alien land laws, which meant that if you were not a citizen, you couldn't purchase land, specifically targeted at these Asian farmers. Japanese were considered aliens ineligible for citizenship. So that means they had no legal pathway to naturalize as citizens. So they were barred from becoming citizens of the US as immigrants. Of course, their children who were born in the US as Nisei were citizens.
Grandfather arrived when he was 16 years old from Japan. And he went up to Washington and worked in a hotel, probably for immigrant Japanese that were coming in. And he was followed by our grandmother, who was a picture bride. So they managed to get down to the Stockton area, which is just south of Sacramento. And it's in that huge agricultural belt. And so they started working there, and each of the sons were born, I mean, sort of one after the other. Uncle Nobi was the eldest, then followed by Monk or Masaru. And then came Yank, and then Uncle Ben, and then my mom, and then a child who died at age 3. And then the twins, who were Darren's dad and uncle. And they traveled wherever they could find work in the valley. They were just following the crops. And they managed to find their way to Gridley, California, which is north of Sacramento and north of Marysville. And during that time, grandmother came down with tuberculosis, which is very common in those times, with very little treatment, and it was pretty fatal for anybody who got it. And she apparently told Uncle Nobi to stay out of school. He had finished 8th grade, and to take care of the family as well as to help with the family income.
Grandpa left to go back to Japan. And here was a family with the oldest being an 8th grader, that would be Uncle Nobi, down to Darren's and my dad, the twins, who were like 5 years old or something, 4 or 5, having to make it on their own. And Uncle Nobi quit school and kept that family together. In today's world, with social services as they are and all, that family would have been split up and put into foster families. And we all know how that might have ended up.
But my mother, I think, She adored and idolized Uncle Nobi. She felt that he was her protector as well as her other older brothers. The brothers took care of her. She took care of the twins. She loved them, and I think they saw her as their mother, even though she was only 4 years older than they.
But luckily, they lived on a nut orchard. I think it was a walnut orchard and maybe fruits as well. They were basically employees who lived on the land, you know? So it was not glamorous accommodations. Dad's recollections are dust and dirt would come up through the wood slats of the floor. It was a shack, tar paper shack. They would put newspaper over the top of the tar paper to kind of keep some of the wind out in the wintertime. But it's not glorious living standards by any means. One of the important sidebars is these are through the lens of my family, through the lens of my father's memories. Every family will have different versions of the stories, slightly different versions, and there's no right version. They're all stories that we understand as part of our identity.
My name is Eiki Tsugai, and I'm from Longview, Washington. It's sort of like a Japanese community, and a lot of times there's a lot of single people living there because they all work at Longview Lumber Company, and the company hires all these Japanese, and they give us a home to live in. My father and my mother came to the United States. Well, one reason they came to the United States is they thought there's a lot of job. They could earn money enough, to make a living. My father passed away when I was 17, and my mother passed away when I was 18, 1 month after I finished my senior year. And then the war broke out.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
When the U.S. entered World War II and declared war against Japan, kind of immediately after that, the government issued what was called exclusion orders across the West Coast. So they established these exclusion zones where they said the military could move out any civilian for national security. But in practice, it only targeted Japanese Americans.
Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move.
So across the West Coast, you saw these signs go up that said, to all persons of Japanese ancestry only. You have like 5 to 10 days to gather up all of your belongings, everything that you can carry, and report to these assembly sites.
Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. Their fishing fleets were impounded and left under guard. Now they were taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed on federally owned lands in the interior.
Basically, immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the FBI came in and took away almost the entirety of Japanese American community leaders like church leaders or temple leaders or judo instructors. So the community really had this vacuum of leadership in this biggest time of crisis when they were facing these quote unquote evacuation orders and being put into the camps.
Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began.
I have an older brother and a younger sister. Well, my parents always told us to keep us together. And so 3 of us went to camp together, and all of us only was able to take 1 suitcase apiece. So whatever we had in our home, we had to get rid of. But our personal belongings we took with us. Whatever we could put into that 1 suitcase. We just bought a refrigerator for change. I was sorry that I had to get rid of that one for practically nothing.
The twins and Uncle Nobi and Aunt Pat joined my parents on the same train. There were armed guards getting them onto the train. They had to keep their shades down, according to my mom's description. They all loaded into the trains in the middle of Marysville, and the train took off and headed north, and they had absolutely no idea where they were going and what it would look like or what to expect.
And I asked my mom, was she scared going to camp? She was just going from 9th grade to 10th grade. She said, I wasn't scared. I just didn't know what was happening. I didn't know where we were going. It was so much just didn't know.
And they only knew that they were headed north because they knew that direction. And that particular train line went north and south. And the only real sign my mother was her peeking at Mount Shasta as they were, as the train was going by during the early morning. And so they knew they were heading up farther up north than they'd really ever thought they would be.
There were 10 incarceration camps that were administered by the War Relocation Authority. There were also actual internment camps, and I use the term internment to specifically mean the detention of aliens, not citizens and not civilians. But the 10 camps that we typically talk about are the 10 War Relocation or WRA camps.
First camp we went to is Tule Lake, and that's in California. In camp, they only give us 1 room for the whole family. And our room was real small, but when we first got there, we had to make our own mattress and put straws in there, and because the camp just was beginning. We were about the first, or maybe the second one there.
So Tule Lake was built in a dried out riverbed, and without any kind of plants or trees or anything. It was just very, very desolate. The barracks were just essentially paper walls. And then in the wintertime, they put up plywood in order to keep the elements out. But as my mother said, it was a shock. It was very upsetting, and they couldn't feel angry at the time. It wasn't until later.
As our long train of evacuees moved slowly into this strange place, which was to be our home, so desolate of trees, dry with the swirling sand blowing in the faces of those who came to welcome us, I cried to myself and asked myself in despair, why? I felt that we were people without a country.
It was kind of a bad time adjusting, but as camp started getting more people in there, and they organized things a little better, we made it into a community.
In each center, a cooperative business association operates stores which handle clothing, toilet articles, and the merchandise which would be needed in any community. The co-ops also run barber shops, beauty parlors, shoe repair shops, and other services for the community. Water mains have to be laid and repaired. Roads, sanitation systems, and buildings have to be maintained. Those who work are paid. Wages by outside standards are low. $12 a month for beginners, $16 a month for most of the workers, and $19 for professional people such as doctors and others on skilled or difficult work. The school curriculum meets the standard of the state where the center is located. Mathematics, American history, geography, the fundamentals of an American education. The evacuees have a form of community self-government which aids the appointed officials in administration of the community. A community council of evacuees is elected to make rules and regulations. Anyone 18 years old or older is eligible to vote in the elections.
For fun, we went to dance every Saturday or something, and we, for dancing, we did jitterbugs. Movie theater, they started opening up. We go to movies, and they had baseball, groups, and so we used to go watch baseball games.
The teams are counted by the hundreds. The evacuees have provided practically all of their own equipment, for little government money has been spent for strictly recreational purposes. About half of the evacuated people were farm folk, skilled producers of vegetables, fruits, and other crops. They had made desert lands productive before, and around the relocation centers they could and did do it again.
A lot of the people there, because they were so knowledgeable about agriculture, they were able to raise crops and raise crops that they liked and that they wanted to eat. And it enabled them to have their own cultural identity and bring that into the camps.
Many talented women dug up shells from the grounds left from the lakebed and made them into beautiful shell crafts. Men dug up roots and made beautiful, polished, decorative items for their rooms. This sort of pastime helped the evacuees to keep their minds occupied.
So in early 1943, the government decided to issue what ended up being called these loyalty questionnaires to basically everyone over the age of 18 who was currently in a camp. And there were two questions in this loyalty questionnaire that really caused a lot of turmoil and conflict among the community. The first was asking if you would declare your loyalty to the United States and the United States government and forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor or to any other foreign power. And then the second question was, are you willing to serve in the United States Army? But for the first one, many of the Issei were ineligible to become citizens of the United States. And so they were like, well, if I say, yes, I forswear allegiance to the Japanese emperor, and I swear loyalty to the United States, I still can't become a citizen. So what does that mean? I'm forswearing this citizenship I have, and I might become stateless. For others, they felt like if they said, yes, I forswear allegiance to the Japanese empire, how could you forswear something you didn't have in the first place, right? And then for the second one about serving in the army, people were like, how dare you? You have imprisoned me for no reason. You've imprisoned my family. You've taken me away from my home. Like, how dare you ask me to then serve in the army and give up my life? Whereas other folks were like, you know what, I think this is the only way that this government is going to understand that Japanese Americans are loyal. So yes, I will serve. I will put my life on the line in, for my community, for my people. And so this caused a lot of controversy. The no boys, as you might imagine, are the men who answered no to both questions, no and no. And they were deemed troublemakers, and they ended up being taken from whatever camp they were in and all taken and put into Tule Lake. There were some other groups, for example, in Heart Mountain, there were some men called the Heart Mountain Resistors who said that they were willing to serve in the army, but you need to first free me and my family from this unjust prison. But they were all tried in a mass trial and found guilty of draft evasion and put in like a real prison.
The loyalty oath created, according to my parents, a lot of turmoil and resentment within the camp. My mom said that they had all signed the loyalty oath as yes. And my mom said that they had to sneak between barracks in order to get within the block to get to meals and to get to the bathroom, because there was a chance that they could be beaten up by those people who felt that, they were being disloyal to the Japanese group. And my mom said that the twins and Uncle Nobi had hot pokers in their potbelly stove. And I said, why was that? And she said, that's if they were ever attacked or their room was ever attacked, they would burn somebody and they'd know who it was that came in.
I think it just really showed the way that the government divided the community amongst itself. There was just so much this long-term resentment and hurt between the no boys, the resistors, the folks who didn't end up serving in the army versus the veterans from the 442 and the MIS.
The Americanism of the great majority of America's Japanese finds its highest expression in the thousands who are in the United States Army. Almost half of them are in a Japanese-American combat team, created by order of the Secretary of War early in 1943. Some of the volunteers came from Hawaii, some from the eastern part of the United States mainland, where there was no mass evacuation. Hundreds of them volunteered while they were in relocation centers. Volunteered to fight against the militarism and oppression of Japan and Germany. They know what they're fighting against, and they know what they're fighting for. Their country, and for the American ideals that are part of their upbringing. Democracy, freedom, equality of opportunity, regardless of race, creed, or ancestry.
But all of my Nisei uncles, I'd say almost all, unless they had some medical condition, served in the military. Whether it was because they either in camp answered yes to the loyalty questions and were drafted, or said yes to the loyalty questions and enlisted, just said, I'm going to go fight in the war, just because I think they felt like this was their country.
my husband, he was in the 442nd. He went in the service, I guess, early until the war ended. He's the type that marches behind the tank company. But he never used to talk too much about service. I guess he had too many unpleasant thoughts. And he always used to have dreams. But one time he said he had a friend in himself in one of the foxhole, and his friend, got shot and fell into the foxhole. He remembers that part. He used to always remember that part.
As a Nisei, with a face just like the enemy, I was always in danger of being shot by my own troops. I was accompanied at all times by a bodyguard with a distinctly non-Japanese face, so that there would be much less of a chance of my own troops mistaking me for an enemy soldier. Among your own unit and your buddies, you were well known, and there was no problem. However, if you went to a different outfit, the men there would give you not only a second look, but a third and fourth look. People always see you as different and out of place, and usually as the enemy.
After they segregated us from the yes and no group, I think the Tule camp got pretty bad. We moved to Heart Mountain, and that's in Wyoming. My brother went out first. He didn't stay very long in Heart Mountain. He went out on education leave and started working in Chicago. And then about 4 months later, he called us out. And we went around December. We went out when it was snowing, they're cold. I think we moved up in 1944, December of 1944. So it must have been about 3 years that we were there.
When the camps were closed, some folks resettled into the Midwest, and that's why we have such a big community of Japanese Americans in Chicago and other places in the Midwest. And some folks went back to California or Oregon or the West Coast where they were originally from. And in most cases found nothing left. In some cases, they had left their farms or their stores to neighbors, some of whom actually took care of them and gave them back. But for the most part, they were gone. They were sold off. So they really had to rebuild everything they had.
Yes, the transfer back to Marysville was, I think they were nervous.
Needless to say, we were elated to return to California. It was a little fearful, and we wondered how we would be received. Fortunately, there were very little incidents, but many "No Japs Allowed" signs had been posted in the windows of business places. We had homes to which to return, but our storage room had been entered, and many of our items had been stolen, including many of our wedding gifts. We were fortunate, as in some other areas, homes of returnees were burned down upon learning that Japanese Americans were allowed to come back to California.
But I think because they were able to go back into that area and it was familiar and they weren't totally removed from what they remember as their neighborhood, I think that made the transition much easier. Because everyone from Marysville, Yuba City, Gridley, Biggs, Colusa, Placer, all of those people went to Tule Lake all together in the train. It was like the whole town just emptied. I think that if they didn't know somebody when they were living in Marysville, if my parents met somebody from Sacramento, the first thing they would say, "Oh, what camp were you in?" When we were young, my parents always mentioned about, "Oh, you remember so-and-so was at camp and so-and-so was at camp. Oh, you know that person, they were from Placer, but they were at camp." And of course, camp to us, I went to Girl Scout camp. And so I thought, wow, that sounds great. I never asked them, what do you talk about camp? I just assumed that everyone goes to camp. And it was almost like an unspoken agreement among the community that no one talked about camps around the younger generations.
And so I felt, and I feel today, that it's an important story because it tells a story about America. Two ways. One, first what happened, that for the first time in the history of our country, all three branches of the government violated the Constitution. They rounded up a group of people because of their race and because they might potentially be dangerous, rounded them up and imprisoned them, in these camps from 1 to 3 years. And no one knew about it.
None of us knew anything about that. None of my friends knew anything about the camps. Their parents didn't talk about it. Anytime camps were discussed, we just assumed they were like Boy Scout or Girl Scout camps.
But growing up Japanese American for me meant growing up Japanese American in the city of Chicago, which was a landing spot for some 70,000 people of Japanese descent. So, we had this built-in community So, values of family began very early, and 2 words you will hear that came out of camp were GAMAN, which it was you just sucked it up and stuck to it and did it. You put your head down and did it. The second word that came out of camp was shikataganai. To me, it meant this is what it is. We do what we have to do.
When I went into the labor market as an architect, I knew I would be in for a hard time. When I went to one of my first interviews, the man said, "No, we can't take you. Some of my clients might resent the fact that you are Japanese because of the recent war." The first time I heard that, I said, "Thank you," and left.
A really common phrase in Japanese and Japanese American culture is called shikataganai, or there's nothing to be done.
There's nothing you can do. It is what it is. And that's how they survived internment camp. They just kind of took it. Where I think the Sansei and Nisei generation were more mad that they didn't do anything about it. Again, when you grew up, we didn't know anything our parents went through. A lot of the Sansei had no idea what the Issei and Nisei went through for them to survive through that time of, going through camp, and so being in prison for who you are, having to fight in the military, and then to have everything taken away, and then you're released back into the world and everyone hates you.
However, by the second time I had had a good deal of experience, and the man looked at my papers at great length and he said, "Mr. Honda, I like everything about you, but you are Japanese. We just had a war with Japan. At that point, I practically blew up in his face. Look, I spent 5 years of my life in the Pacific fighting for your right to sit back and tell me this sort of shit. It didn't come to blows, but this is how I felt."
Going through the camp experience, they didn't talk about it as Sansei started to learn more about what happened to them and how they just didn't say anything and they just took it, which is how they got by. They just kept their mouth shut and just wanted it to be over, right? They didn't want to cause any problems. In fact, if you investigate when the reparations bill got signed much later, that wasn't even fought by the Issei and Nisei. Because they didn't want to talk about it, they didn't care about it, right? Where the Sansei generation was mad, and they fought for the justice to happen to get a national apology, which was actually the most important thing to the Issei and Nisei.
So in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of civil rights activism, social justice activism at the time, and kind of aligned with that, the Japanese American community, the Sansei, so third generation, began thinking about we need some kind of redress, we need some kind of acknowledgement, apology, like you said, of what happened to our parents and to our grandparents during World War II.
Fellow Americans, we gather here today to right a grave wrong. We must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake. For here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law. Yes, the ideal of liberty and justice for all, that is still the American way.
A lot of, you'll probably hear this across the board, but our grandparents and our parents really didn't talk much about the camps. My grandfather on my mom's side didn't really talk much at all because he was part of the 442, the 442nd Regiment. And usually people who have gone through war don't like to talk about it afterwards. And then on top of the fact that I think the general feeling was that they were ashamed. They were just trying to prove they were American. They thought they did something wrong. They were ashamed of it. They're trying to prove they're American. They dropped the language. That's why I don't speak Japanese and my parents don't speak Japanese. Obviously, we lost all of our heirlooms or any family items that we had because they had to pack up whatever was on their back and leave their houses and sell it for really cheap because they're all forced to go out. So we kind of lost a lot of history and a lot of connection to any Japanese ancestral roots that we might have. And that ancestral history, which was kind of shut off for us because our grandparents kind of decided what's best for the family, and that was to assimilate. That was to be as white as possible. That was to not use Japanese languages. You know, even the food, Japanese American food is very different than Japanese food. They took kind of a combo of American and Japanese food and mixed it. And so I grew up very much not knowing about my roots, not knowing about the history, not knowing about the incarceration camps, and really kind of just trying to fit in with being white.
It's so funny growing up in Southern California as a Hapa, half white, half Japanese. Was a little bit different. I was raised by my Japanese grandparents and my mom. And like, I would say I was a lot more Japanese in who I was characteristically. I think I was more of like a people pleaser, not making any waves, the perfect student, making all the best choices, making sure my mom had something to like brag about with the family, just enduring bullying or just a lot of things without lashing out, without really getting terribly upset about it. I felt lonely and isolated. And I think as I've grown up, being a part of Hollywood, you're not gonna get ahead by quietly enduring. You're not going to get ahead by being a wallflower. You're not going to get ahead by letting people walk all over you. And so I had to battle with, can I be Japanese and not have those characteristics?
And then I played a lot of sports, right? 3-sport athlete, 4-sport athlete, 5-sport athlete during junior high. And that's where a lot of racism came out for me. People call me Jap, they call me Chink, they said go back to where you came from, you know, the works, right? And that's where then race became a thing for me. I realized what, you know, racism was at a young age and it being directed towards me. You know, at that time, I identified as white. I tried to be as white as possible to fit in. You know, you're young, you don't really know that. And so I was racist towards Asians just to fit in, right? That was like my coping mechanism, and it was really one of those things that I don't realize till I'm older of how much of an impact that has in my life, right? Of you not really identifying with who you truly are and understanding that.
So I had been to Japan for work before, but I've never really immersed myself in the culture and learned a lot about it. The fall of 2023, Sharon and I, we decided to go on a trip to Japan, first time from a leisure perspective. And before I went, I thought, gee, it'd be really cool to know if we have any relatives left in Japan. There was no connection between at least the Honda family since 1969, 1970 was interesting. And the fact that cousins really didn't have much information about any of that family. I had a friend of mine who was Japanese help translate a letter in Japanese, send it to the temple nearest to the place I thought they would be, and just took a total guess and just sent a letter there and said, hey, this is stuff I know. Do you know if I have any family there? And just surprisingly, 2 or 3 weeks later, I got a letter from a cousin I didn't know I had in Japan.
で、まあ最近になってなんか気になるしっていくと、どうやったら住所わかるかなっていうことを私はちょっと探しはしてたんですが分かんなくって、それで、困ったなと思うところにまず今現在その日本のその本田家っていうのはね、やっぱり親戚がすごく少なくなってきてるんですよ。でなんか寂しいなと思ってたんだけども、で私のところも子供がいないから、そう思ってた時に急にアメリカの皆さんとつながってきて、ダレンさんからその、お寺の方に連絡があってつながったと、またつながったということになるんでしょうか。 アメリカに日本の家族が次にたくさん増えたというので、
Before sending that letter to the temple to find my cousin, it was honestly just more of a curiosity. It wasn't a deep interest even at that point yet, because I'm pretty far removed from my Japanese culture that I didn't feel that connection. When I met my cousin in Japan, and not only met my cousin, but I went to the ancestral village. I went to our ancestral home. I was in the home where they grew up. I went to the ancestral grave where my grandfather, who I've never met, was buried, and all our ancestors were buried. And even my cousin had gotten something called a koseki. It's a Japanese family register, and he had provided me at least the koseki he had for his family. So just imagine meeting somebody who's a total stranger, who's your blood relative, and you both don't speak the same language. So it was the strangest initial meeting, but as you start to converse about your lives, you learn that those values are the same.
これやっぱり不思議なもんですね。初対面っていう感じがあんまりなかったんです。で、何かね、なんかよくわかんないけど、なんかね、懐かしいような、なんか不思議な雰囲気、それをすごく感じたんで、それはきっとその先祖がどうとつながってるんですね、これ。これ本当に嬉しく思ってます。
You talk about you don't know who you are till you know where you've come from, right? I think that trip for me became like a leisurely trip, just for us to visit Japan the first time, to a very deeply meaningful trip for me, and it made me feel much more connected to our culture, and made me feel a lot more like I know where I came from. So that's why we brought my kids to Japan, to explain to them why it's important to not forget where you came from.
The trip, it was 3 weeks with my parents and my sister. For me and my sister not knowing much about Japanese culture in Japan, to go through that together, it was an awesome experience.
I think it was really important and valuable for me to just see the culture and like where it actually came from. It feels like, like growing up, I felt like I knew I was Japanese American, but the Japanese part of it felt like a little far away from me, if that makes sense. But I think the learning about what happened before me and learning the stories of my grandparents, that meant more to me. It makes me proud, and it makes me want to continue to pass it along to other generations.
As I said, as a child and growing up, didn't really know much about the culture. But getting to experience it myself and getting closer to my roots, it makes me want to preserve that and harvest it a little bit more in myself and for future generations, and feel that deeper connection and care for Japanese culture and where we came from.
And I think that is something that I'm going to pass down to my daughter, knowing that everything that she's accomplished, where she is, who she is, stems from the strength of my grandparents, that strength that's now in her, and appreciate the work that came before her.
Went to Indiana University for school, and that's where I met my first Asian friend that I met on my own. He was from Hawaii. He was half Jewish, half Japanese American. So he was more cultured than I was, more proud of it, so that helped me out a lot. I really started my identity discovery. And then after school, I got a job at Asian American Institute, which rebranded to Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, which I work now. And once I started there, I finally realized I'm Japanese American, understood the incarceration, really dove into that history, and it was really enlightening for me. And ever since then, I've just been open-minded and learned and been able to really kind of pass that on to the next generation.
to my next generation. I said, learn as much as you can about your own heritage and learn what you can about your own family as well. So I felt that maybe because I'm a Christian, I figured that maybe that was my, destination, that I had to do these things. It was my life's journey. And even now, I don't, regret all that I had to do. America was still our home.
Yeah, so I think the question about the American dream, so I think, even us to this day, American dream is still something that we all strive for. But I think the Nisei are the ones who lived in the camp, and they went and fought in the war, and they had things taken away from them, and when they were released, they had to navigate their way through a world of discrimination and hate, right, against them. So I think, and just in one generation, from being removed from basically imprisonment and poverty, right, to turn it around, I think in one generation, I think is a pretty major success story and living out the American dream. And I think, again, part of this video is so that future generations understand that. And so don't screw it up, right? Son of chocolate? Oh, I have to look on the tree. Yeah. On the tree. Looking for names?
これを調べたら調査料もらって調査料。
ああ、お金？
OK。